Someone named one of the great African Seminoles?
Abraham.
Chief Abraham. Anybody else? Billy Bolex. And Billy Bolex, you will find that name a lot in the Bahamas because when the African Seminoles fled from Florida shores during the 1820s onto the 1840s, they went into Andros, Bahamas. In fact, as I was doing the research for my curriculum on the Underground Railroad, and I started reading a book by Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, The Seminoles of the Bahamas. As I looked through the book, it became a very mystical experience because I saw my name there. We're cousins from Tennessee, and I saw Newton, and I looked a little further, and there was my grandfather-in-law, who was a Black Seminole, who descended from, you wouldn't guess who, Moses. Moses Newton, who fled over to Andros, Bahamas. And so there, in the research, was showing the linkage of the Seminoles all the way to the Bahamas. And surprisingly enough, my husband's family in Nassau knew nothing about it, but the family in Andros knew all about it. You know how families are sometimes. So it was a pleasure to be able to relate to them that they were descended from our people here on these shores. But when you were calling the names, there's one name that you might have forgotten to call, and his name was John Horse.
Right.
John Horse and Wildcat, Coacuchi. That was one of the most powerful cross-cultural connections that you would ever want to run into. They were a symbol of the Black Seminole and the Red Seminole who stood together and who refused to be parted, no matter how many times they were attacked. They had three powerful Seminole wars. And I tell you, if the Seminoles had had the weaponry of the military, of the Navy, of the slaveholders who constantly came after them, Florida would still be international territory. Because when they came into Florida, many times they came in with 3 times the number of the Seminoles, sometimes 7 times, and many times that they were defeated, and they had to flee back into Georgia, they had to flee back into South Carolina, they had to flee back into Alabama. You had the Red Sticks who came from Alabama, those were the Seminoles who stood up against colonialists who tried to take over their land. They fled into Florida. They came together with the Seminoles who were already there, who were part of the Creeks. They were also part of the Creeks. Then you had the Black Seminoles who came in from different parts, including the vast majority who were Gullah Geechees. But when they came in, they melded together as one society. When you're reading about Seminole literature, you will hear the Africans referred to time and time again as slaves. But how are you going to have a slave when the people say we're not going to move without them? How are you going to have a slave when they don't do anything unless they consult with them? How are you going to have a slave when the slave is running the farm, and the slave is the interpreter? The slave is, the so-called slave is the consultant. And when the so-called master is ready to die rather than part from that slave. Is that a slave? No. That sounds like family to me, right? And so this is what happened throughout the period of the Seminoles. I wish I could really tell you a lot more, but I will tell you that you may not hear it a lot in history. In fact, there should be movies about the African Seminoles, because you hear about the cowboys of the West, and now we're starting to hear a little bit about the black cowboys. But the Seminoles had vast holdings of cattle, they had horses, they had land, and one of the things that kept them attacking them again and again was that some of them who were former slaves were more prosperous now than the slaveholders. And others who had never been slaves had even surpassed their ancestors. So they went in 1807 when, I want to try to show this, but it's so much. When I wrote my book, Free Globally, the International Underground Railroad, I didn't write it as a scholar, even though I did a lot of scholarly research. I'm basically what I call an ancestral storyteller. So I wrote my book in the tradition of my grandmama Anna Pearl, who used to tell stories while she was making sweet bread in the Tennessee kitchen. So this is how I tell the story of the Seminoles in the book. If Queen Quet will allow me, I would also like to tell you in terms of the International Underground Railroad, I don't know if you know that it also extended back to Africa. Because in 1730, you had the Africans who took over a slave ship in the midst of the Middle Passage and forced them to sail all the way back to Africa. And that wasn't the Amistad, that was called the Little George. In 1732, you had another group of Africans who took over another slave ship, forced it back to their ancestral homeland. So when you hear about certain things, they're just symbologies of masses of great things by unknown people which have been done. So in closing, when you think of the Seminoles, think of the great ones like John and Susan Horst. Susan Horst, who came from the great chief July, who married John Horst. They were together for 40 years. When they came into Seminole territory, they stole their children and took them into slavery. But still, they stood strong. They took the children of Wildcat, Coacuchi, took them into slavery. They took the elders. They took all of the family that they could take to try to break the spirit, but they could never break that spirit. They stood through Florida, they stood through Oklahoma, which was in Arkansas, they stood through Mexico, they stood through Spain, they stood all across the globe. Osceola, John Horst, Susan Horst, July, Sampson, Chief Abraham, Jumper, Alligator. I wish I could tell you so much more, but we give tribute to them all.
And every one of those last names that you just heard Sister Linda call out can be seen in the Seminole Scout Cemetery in Bracketville, Texas. Elder Carly Town, who is our Minister of Information for the Gullah Geechee Nation, and I traveled there last year along with Brother Kwame Shaw of All Mobile Productions, who is yet another sponsor of ours and who is our engineer for this entire event. We traveled there and saw with our own eyes these names, Wilson and all of the other names you listed. And when you go over into Mexico and you go to Nacimiento, you see the same names, but you see Julio instead of July. So every name is still the same, just in Spanish there. And now, unfortunately, in Mexico, where they're called Muskogo, our people are called Muskogo, they have been blocked out of continuing to be the agricultural people that Sister Linda just spoke about, because what they did was start to tap their water supply and redirect it away from where they lived, so that their ground became arid instead of still being fertile. And so that has started to drive the younger population of Muskogo, Gullah Geechee, Seminoles out of Mexico, and they want to come into the United States. But then the United States doesn't want to accept them because they consider them Mexicans. But the Mexican government says, but they're not Mexicans because they're Muskogos. They were from them Seminoles that we let them stay here way back when. So that they don't want to own them really, and then the U.S. won't let them in. And you see the U.S. hardly want to let you in here if they can get you out. If you got a passport, you better hold on to it. And so that's the thing now, is that we are in an international dynamic consistently throughout. Because you're talking about people and their freedom of movement being infringed upon even now. So even if I take your water so that you don't get to eat from your land to try to force you out, you can't even go home to your people. Because when you get to the border, somebody else now owns the border and says, we don't want you coming back in here to meet with your people. And so we have that dynamic. So even many of them wanted to come to this event, couldn't get visas to come out of Mexico. And then there are those that are in Oklahoma and Texas that sent greetings to everyone here and feel that this is a powerful activity, but financially now cannot make it. So there are a lot of other dynamics to this that are in this story.